Welcome to the Asia Chessboard, the podcast that examines geopolitical dynamics in Asia and takes an inside look at the making of grand strategy. I'm Andrew Schwartz at the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
Welcome back to the Asia Chessboard. I'm Mike Green, and I'm joined by an old friend, Nobukatsu Kanehara, who is a professor now at Doshisha University in Kyoto, Japan. He's had a distinguished career in the Japanese foreign ministry. He's from the French school, trained in French, an outstanding French chef, I can tell you. But he's had key posts in the U.S. and in his last role as the Deputy Secretary General of the National Security Council Secretariat in Japan, essentially what in the U.S. we would call the Deputy National Security Advisor, and as Deputy Director of the Cabinet Intelligence and Research Office. Really one of the key architects of Abe Shinzo's grand strategy, which continues to be a compass not only for Japan, but for many countries in the Indo-Pacific, including the United States. Nobu, great to have you on. So you joined the foreign ministry in the early 80s and saw some big changes. What did it look like to you, Nobu?
Thank you very much for having me. I joined Foreign Service 81. This was the turning point for Japan's foreign policy. Post-1970s, Japan's a pure pacifist free rider and the economically very big nation. And the 97th Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and Reagan stood out, right? And the Nakasone appeared in our system, and he changed the Japanese foreign policy drastically. We should be realistic. We are no longer only defeated nation. We should be responsible for supporting this free world. And he said Japan is among the West. That had a very big repercussion inside Japan because many thought we are with the Soviet Union, socialists and communists. And then big turn started in 1980s. I was just excited. Well, this realism is happening.
Is that why you joined Gaimusho? Because of the Nakasone, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the New World?
Foreign ministry has a longer tradition before Nakasone. It is Yoshida Shigeru, his diplomat. Yoshida was heavily attacked by pushing Japan into the West by the San Francisco Peace Treaty. Japan is the only one nation where the first and second opposition parties were with Soviet Union. No country was like that. Our domestic Cold War was real. Absolutely no realism. It's ideological. Anything that the LDP government does for strengthening Japan-US alliance, the socialist communists are against it. We are in that situation up to 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. But the big turn happened with Nakasone, pushed back this sort of leftist trend. No, we are not neutral. We are among the West. We're no longer the only defeated nation. We should support this system together with the Americans and Europeans. So we are in G7. Just remember that. This was Nagasone's message. And I heard that. This man is good, I thought. And I read a book written by the Walter Lippmann called The Shield of the Republic. That book shocked me too. The United States was just like Japan, isolationist, and the total pacifist, abhorred the military power. And after Pearl Harbor, the United States changed and started to support the world order with force. But how this happened to them and how the Americans were thinking before Pearl Harbor. I read that this Shield of the Republic. I was very much shocked. And I thought to myself, we have to do the same change again in Japan. We can no longer be a free rider of this system. Now it's time to stand up. And that's Nakasone's message.
Yeah, I began studying Japan and going to Tokyo University and stuff when Nakasone was prime minister. And, in 1982, I think it was, his foreign minister went to the U.S. and called the U.S.-Japan alliance an alliance, dome, and created a scandal. It was a very different time. You came in very much influenced by Nakasone's thinking about Japan as a more proactive part of the West, part of the G7, an ally. But in a lot of ways, he was not part of the mainstream. It wasn't really until Koizumi and then Abe that this became mainstream thinking. So most of your career, Nobu, you were one of the outsiders in the foreign ministry, weren't you? You must have been.
I have to say that the foreign ministry is in a vein of Yoshida Shigeru. So the Kochikai, Kishida-san's faction, Aso-san's faction is the heir of Yoshida. But you have to know the very strong vein of realism. Realists are in the foreign ministry. The dean is Ambassador Kato, who was the ambassador in the United States, right? And we had the Owada-san, he was the ambassador to UN and the deputy minister. He is the father of the empress. And Yanai-san, the chief judge of the Law of the Sea Tribunal in Hamburg. We have a very strong vein that's come just from the Yoshida-san. Prime Minister Yoshida, the only one big message is just to protect this Japan-US alliance. We should be realistic. We are realists and don't kowtow to the pressure from Moscow. You have to fight. This is the fight in the domestic Cold War. When Japan got independent in 1952, we had no army. We had no military. We had no military forces. We have no defense ministry neither. It was only foreign ministry who was supporting this alliance and who had to defend this alliance in the Diet sessions that was heavily influenced by socialist communists at that time. The core of the foreign ministry after the war is we are the guardian of this alliance. This is in the Diet. It was Shina Sensei, Yomeda, right? It's a very, very strong minority, but very strong minority that supported this alliance management. We have the long line of this. The Matsunaga-san, he was the vice minister of the foreign ministry. He is one of them. I am the son of this family.
Yes, very much so. The heir apparent of this line, and you mentioned my one-time boss and mentor, Shina Sensei, Shina Moto from Iwate Prefecture, who was within the LDP and the Diet, the go-to politician for people like Kato-Ryozo and yourself and Dewada and others to get political support in the Diet for the alliance. But in the 80s, late 80s, I worked for him in Tokyo. Nakasone supported you, but a lot of Japanese politicians were afraid of defense, afraid of national security, afraid of realism. The foreign ministry also, I know over the course of your career, you had to battle for more realism, more of a national security frame for issues. And you were often fighting the mainstream, I think, within the foreign ministry.
I don't think so. I had always the big bosses who protected me, the Ambassador Kato, Ambassador Ebihara. And there are, as I said, strong bosses, the guardians of Japan-US alliance. The number is not very big, but they're the strongest section in the Japanese foreign ministry.
Yeah. So you and I are saying the same thing. You're talking about the quality of the people. I'm talking about the quantity. The numbers were on the other side. But you had intellectual heavyweight.
It's nationwide. Kishi and Yoshida, these were two big fathers of the Japan-US alliance. They brought the alliance to birth. But they were the very high-ranking officials, ministers of the Imperial Japan. They know how Japan was agonized when we had no alliance, facing Russians, Chinese, and Americans, and all the Westerners. They knew how to survive in this. The Cold War starts, we should be in the West. After Kishi, the prime ministers were all the pupils of Yoshida School, and he picked up the high-ranking economic ministry's officials because he was simply disappointed at the quality of Imperial Diet members.
Yeah.
So he picked up youngsters. But these were I have to say, petty economic ministers. They are not the caliber of Kishi and Yoshida. And the socialist communists were, of course, faithful to Moscow. They continued to attack the Japan-US alliance. 1960, big rioting happened when Kishi revised the Japan-US alliance treaty, and President Eisenhower canceled his trip to Japan. After that, the LDP stopped talking about security, national security, and they continued to make small concessions all the time. The three principles, no principles of nuclear weapons, or an absolute ban of the Japanese arms to even to the United States, and the GDP 1% ceiling of the defense budget. These things are absolutely against Japanese national interests, but they did it. That's the LDP. LDP changed after Kishi, and then Nakasone tried to kick it back.
But it only changed briefly, and the mainstream control of the party, of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, was the Tanaka faction, which generally preferred not to talk about security and defense and preferred economics.
Tanaka is representative of the post-war Japan.
Very much.
He scattered money all over Japan and brought up the living standard of the rural parts. He was respected for that, but he has no strategic sense. He was saying the Beijing, Washington, Japan should be with the same distance with Beijing and Washington. He had no strategic sense. That's the reason why he was praised for normalization with China, but he had no deep sense of strategy. That was his weakness.
And his leadership style became the mainstream leadership style. Nakasone was an exception. And then the next big exception was Koizumi when I was in the White House and you were in the embassy. But that was fairly brief because then you had all the chaos in the LDP and then the DPJ. And then Abe came back. And that's what I want to talk about next, because Abe's 8 years, and you were with him, that permanently changed the debate. Tell the people listening who are not as nerdy as we are about Japanese politics, tell them about the big legacies from Abe's term that you saw with him by his side and see today.
He is 5 years senior to me. If he were to be alive, he is to be 71 now. He is the son of the post-war Japan. He doesn't know anything about Imperial Japan. He was born in 1954, just before the economic expansion of Japan. He knows only free Japan and the free world. And when he got into the high school, the West changed a lot. Okay, there's no racism, colonial rules, and the social gap was decreased because of welfare states. So Marxism was almost fading at that time. Abe-san is the representative of New Japan. And he said, one, these values that we believe today, freedom and democracy and rule of law, this is universal. We can accept it as Japanese. We are Buddhist, we are Confucius, not white Christian, but this is universal values. So we have to expand this from Atlantic to Indo-Pacific. That's his idea. So he sets the free and open Indo-Pacific, including, of course, free navigation. And this was his biggest message. The Asia is now becoming bigger than EU plus UK plus US in this century, including India and China. So we should be responsible. These values must be global. We have to sustain this global liberal order, not only American, European liberal order. These are the new tasks, new jobs of the new Asians, and I am the first. That was his message. That resonated strongly inside Japan and outside Japan. He is trying to redress our statecrafts for national security because it was so badly damaged. He created once the NSC, National Security Council. Maybe Europeans and Chinese don't understand this, but our system was very weak. Emperor has no power. He's there for more than 1,000 years, but he's just a priest. He has no power. And then below that, the big warlords are there. And they fight against each other. Nobody is responsible for managing this country as a top. This is our system. Even under Meiji Imperial time, the same thing. And in Showa time, this was the same thing. Prime ministers are very weak, just like emperor. It's only Nakasone, Koizumi, and Abe said, I am ruling this nation. I'm responsible. I am commanding my forces. That's Abe and Nakasone. So he created NSC. The foreign ministry and the defense ministry are barking against each other. They never shared information, intelligence. It was awful. It was just like imperial time. So Abe said, come to see me with one voice. Don't fight in front of me. This is the reason why NSC was established. This is a great contribution to Japanese constitutional system. Without this, we did a big mistake. Pearl Harbor, Manchuria, invasion, everywhere. This is absolutely necessary to combine the intelligence, the foreign service, and the military and economic affairs agencies under one big, strong leadership. And for that purpose, he needed a small bureaucracy, just like NSC, inside Prime Minister's office. And he just realized that. He tried to do that in 2006, but he got sick. He retired. And just after he took office, he said, well, I have to do that, he said. And he created his own Prime Minister's office. Then he ordered the NSC to draft the national security strategy. Americans have that. Many other nations have that. Why don't they have that? He ordered us to write the national security strategy. Before that, people don't understand where Japan is headed for. Sometimes pro-US, pro-China. And what's the strategy of Japan? People are saying, we couldn't have that simply because the socialist communists were faithful to Moscow. LDP was faithful to Washington. Absolutely no common ground. It was a zero-sum game. We couldn't have a national strategy. Now the Soviet Union collapsed. Leftists are much weaker. And oppositions are quite realistic these days. So Abe said, let's do that. And he did it. Biggest contribution of Abe is constitutional interpretation change. The United Nations Charter, Japan-US Security Treaty, even Japan-Soviets common joint declarations. We write every time Japan has the collective defense rights under the UN Charter. We wrote that every time. But when Vietnam War started, Kishi said, we don't send troops there. Many Asian nations did, Koreans and others, but we said we don't do that. And this statement became strangely a constitutional interpretation and said we have no rights of collective self-defense. This happened because of backdoor negotiations with the oppositions. LDP was just like that. They conceded incrementally to the oppositions and banned themselves. But now Japan is very big. Soviet Union collapsed and now invading Ukraine and closer to China. China is very big today and aiming at Taiwan. And Japan is the only one big ally of the United States in Asia. We can't stand alone and leaving Americans do everything in Asia. Hashimoto-san and Obuchi-san said we can help Americans fighting in the Korean Peninsula. And this is 1991. That's Obuchi did. But Obuchi said not only for non-combat operations. But the Abe said the cooking rice, applying the bondage is fine, but it's not deterrence, right? If we want to deter Chinese, we have said we might be in the war from the outset. Then this is a deterrence, he said. So he changed the constitutional interpretation. He said Japan had the right of collective self-defense. For somewhat very strange, vague reasons, government said we don't have that. We can't use that, but we have to change that. We had it, we're going to use it. That's Abe-san. And Abe raised twice the consumption tax from 5 to 10, and he secured a 10 trillion yen additional tax revenue, and he gave 10% to the defense ministry. It's a modest decrease, only 10%. Kishida-san said double it. He was great. He was great. And the last thing is he made the 70 years anniversary of the Pacific War, and he made a big statement. And Murayama-san said it, and Koizumi-san did, and Abe-san, he the third time. Abe-san's time was very much loaded because he truly tried to solve the issue of the past. Japanese could not come to terms with the past because of the generational gap. Imperial time people, Marxist generation, and us. And the Marxists were very happy with the Murayama statement, the 50th anniversary. He said, we invaded everywhere, I'm sorry. that's Murayama. We never do this again. But the conservative, in particular, the very senior people who were in the war, their thinking was this, okay, war was bad, okay, Pearl Harbor was bad, that's fine, everything was bad. But when Japan was defeated, Dutch, French, British came back with the guns to reconquer Asia. Why aren't they punished? That's their question. And Abe had the answer to this. He's a youngster. He doesn't know Imperial Japan at all, right? But he had to persuade these senior people. Without doing that, we could not establish a new national identity. Abe wanted to have a new national identity as a Western, as a leader of the West, right? But he had to persuade this. He made a big conferences, many meetings, and met many people. And his conclusion was, okay, look back 100 years as a whole. Don't look at only Japan. Okay, we redressed many bad things, fixed it. Okay, war prohibited, 45. And after that, okay, Europeans came back with the guns to reconquer Asia, but they were wrong too. The Reverend King just abolished the racial discrimination, it was spread globally immediately, right? And the colonial rules was abolished because Asians stood up, Africans stood up, and Soviet Union collapsed. Okay, this is where we are. Let's take a vintage point here. We can deny everything that was bad. Bad is bad, good is good. That's Abe. The Abe said after 1 year of, he agonized himself because he had the answer to these questions himself. And he said, war is bad, that's fine, but colonial rules are bad. Racial discrimination is bad. You don't complain. It's over. We have to stand up as a new leader. That was Abe. Abe just made a lot of effort for doing that. Okay, these are the assets of Abe.
They're huge. I mean, they're absolutely transformational. On the creation of a National Security Council and a more centralized strategic decision-making process, he wasn't just reversing 70 years of post-war bureaucratic stovepiping. He was taking on 2,000 years of Japanese political culture and clan warfare and pre-war rivalry between the Army and Navy. You know, in the interpretation of Article 9 to allow collective defense, what that represented was not just some sort of, ideological or legal debate. It was a fundamental decision, I think, that Japan had to be willing to take on more risk and more burden not out of sentimentality to the U.S., but to restore deterrence at a time of deteriorating deterrence based on a real careful calculation of the changing balance of power. And I think the other thing he did was he really, I wrote this in my book, but he really profoundly situated Japan's strategy in a maritime concept. A lot of the Tanaka faction people, a lot of the post-war leaders, some of the pre-war leaders who got Japan out of the war thought of Japan as really affixed to the continent of Asia. And what Abe embraced was people like Sakamoto Ryoma in the Meiji period, that Japan's destiny will be determined by the seas and the maritime partners. And that's why he was so enthusiastic about the Quad. I've written, and I think the evidence is pretty clear, this had a huge influence on thinking in the Trump administration, in Australia and Britain and Indonesia. Did it have a big impact on Ishiba-san? Let's talk about the current Prime Minister, Ishiba Shigeru. How much of this strategy do you see in how Ishiba-san's government is approaching the U.S. and Asia?
Ishiba-san is implementing Abe Kishida strategy. He was picked up as the Secretary General of LDP in the second Abe government for the initial phase, and he left. He stayed outside the mainstream, continued to criticize Abe for 10 years, and now he's now Prime Minister. And so he has to swallow it. Because Abe, Suga, Kishi, they build up upon themselves, right? And this is where we are. And these 10 years are huge accumulation change. And now Ishiba-san should transform himself from critic to a great prime minister. So he has to implement it. Now he's running a lot. And I don't think he's going to change. He's going to change. He is not going to change this. He's going to implement it. And one more thing is he lost the majority in the lower house. He cannot take bold decisions. He just stay the course carefully.
Is his idea of an Asian NATO, he wants to create an Asian NATO, his idea of revising the terms of U.S. bases in Japan, the Status of Forces Agreement, these are a bit, let's say, unconventional and certainly not the way Abe thought. What do you make of those kind of original Ishiba ideas on foreign policy?
That's his idea, but the one professor in Tokyo just wrote in his TED and just presented that to the Hudson Institute. I'm sure that when he wrote it, and when he asked him to write it, he had no intention to become prime minister. This is just for campaign trail. And after becoming prime minister, he never mentions that. NATO Asia, if the Taiwan contingency were to happen, if the allies are gathered and had to fight against China, after that, there could be some headquarters for military coordinations. There could be some Asia, NATO, with some very limited number of nations. But now we're talking about engaging Chinese and persuading them not to attack Taiwan and continue this business exercises. And the Asian nations don't come to this. They are still divided, getting money from Japan and China and the United States and keeping good faith to everybody. That is still very much many nations in Asia. And Asian NATO is not realistic now at this moment. The withdrawal of U.S. forces from Japan, this is absolutely against Japanese interests. This is absolutely against what Kishi protected for this nation. And Ishiba-san sometimes danced to the music of leftists, and this is very wrong. But the good news is he never mentioned this after he became prime minister.
Ishiba-san had what looked like a pretty successful summit with President Trump, especially after President Zelensky of Ukraine's absolutely disastrous meeting with Trump and J.D. Vance in the Oval Office. Very different, of course. People need to remember that this administration wants to pivot from Europe to Asia and needs Japan to do that. They think they don't need Ukraine. The president has a personal animosity to Zelensky that goes back years, whereas he doesn't really know Ishiba. So there's some big differences, but I'd say so far, the best summit the world has seen, I know in Australia and elsewhere they watched it with reassurance, was with Ishiba-san. The worst was with Zelensky. I'll come back to Ukraine because it has implications for Japan. But what was your take on the Ishiba-Trump summit? Do you think everything's okay now, or do you think he just got lucky? Or do you think from Abe-san's experience, he's going to have a lot of summits? You know, the joke was Abe-san didn't have 20 summits. He had the same summit 20 times. But what was your take on the strategic?
Everything you said is right. We have many experience and the investments and the savings with Trump administration. Abe-san tried to send maybe 2-3 messages to President Trump, and he was successful. Well, one is, of course, Japan is important in Asia. We have no NATO, and the Korea is important, but they flip-flop the governments, leftist and conservative. Australia is a very strong ally, but they're far away and in the southern hemisphere. So Japan is important anyway. 1, 2, Japan is making efforts. We're doubling defense budget. And Abe's time was not yet, but Kishida said we are going to double defense budget. That would push up Japan number 3 defense budget nation on earth. And the Abe said we changed the constitutional interpretations. Your carriers, Kitty Hawk and George Washington, were protected by our fighters, by our Aegis ships. And Trump didn't know that. Oh, really? He said, and he changed his mind. Another big message is, this is not the government, this is private sector. But Japan is now number 1 investor in the United States, even bigger than UK these 5 years. We're number 2 before. UK is the colonial nation of the United States. They're there in the United States for 500 years, right? We're in the United States only 50 years. But now Japan is the biggest investor because of the strong yen. And the yen was 360 yen, $1 before, right? Now it's 150. So Japan could invest a lot. Our investment is not M&A. Our investment is to transfer factories to the United States, employ people, and the car makers are also employ car dealers. We just sustain millions of jobs in the United States. In 50 states, the Japanese companies are working with Americans happily. Our economies are now one. And when the Plaza Accord happens, my big boss, Ambassador Kato, said, Nobu, this is very bad for Japan's economy. But believe me, after this, Japan-US alliance will be revived. We're going to have a very good relationship with Washington. He was right. And this is where we are. So the big investments is also the message to him. And so Ishiba-san, he stays the course. He is stepping up based upon the Abe's and Kishida's achievements. At first we're there, it's okay. And I have to say, we have Takao, he's an interpreter, he's a small prime minister. And we know very well the personality of President Trump, how to deal with them. Short-tempered Zelensky was a fatal mistake. You can never lose your temper before the president, and you should behave yourself. I think it's rather Vice President Vance's mistake. He is not president. He should not talk to Zelensky in that way. And Zelensky lost temper. It's a disaster for everybody. The deal was not very bad. The deal was. Can I talk about Ukraine now?
Yeah, but let me quickly just jump in on one interesting thing you said there, just parenthetically. Interpreters, you and I have been in a lot of summits. A good interpreter can make all the difference.
Yes.
The interpreter has to accurately convey what the leader said to the other leader, but they can do it with a certain style or character that captures the emotion or the positive elements of what's being said. And Japan's had very good interpreters, it's true. Yeah, let's talk about Ukraine. I agree with you. Vice President Vance broke tradition and did a lot of damage by intervening the way he did. President Zelensky should probably have read a bit more about how Abe-san handled President Trump. That's the way you do it, but we are where we are. There's going to be ups and downs. We'll see where the Ukraine thing ends up, but this has to be a bit worrying for allies, of course, in Europe, but also in Asia. So what's your thinking about Ukraine and the future of Ukraine and the future of Putin's attack and what that all means for Japan and for allies in Asia?
First of all, this is against our basic principle. You can't change the border without the consent of the people living there. That's United Nations Charter. You don't use forces against them. Putin, the P5 member, Russia, is now breaking this rule, invading Ukraine, killing 10,000 people, innocent people, right? And this can never be tolerated. Okay, a principle is very simple. Putin is saying this land was mine, so I take it back by force. People there belong to me. That's 19th century. It's over. Well, our response is, but they hate you because you attacked them. So you have no rights to stay there. Okay, that's our stance. And Kishida said exactly that today's Ukraine is tomorrow's East Asia, Taiwan. And this is how we feel. If we tolerate that, we're going back to 19th century. Xi Jinping is saying exactly the same thing. This island is mine. I take it back by force, and people there belong to me. And our response is, sir, 100 years, they are living different history from yours, and they are much, much better off than you. And they can never accept dictatorship. They hate you. So this is the same thing. This is basically against our core values. We cannot accept it. But the militarily, strategically, if the war is prolonged and the Americans, Europeans are entering into the war, and if they spend too much energy, we fear that the pivot will stop there. So we wish to somehow bring this war, but not give any gift to Putin. What's going on is opposite. Our thinking was Biden administration had no clear end state of this war. That was our fear. It was just like Vietnam War. What would you do? The diplomatic maneuvering was brilliant under Blinken and Jake Sullivan, but we fear their military intervention and helping the arms to Ukrainians are too little, too small. Then Putin consolidated his positions, and we can no longer take it back. It was too late. And then how to finish that? Putin will refuse to return territories, but what we can do unilaterally, of course we can talk to Putin, but in the end what we can do unilaterally is to continue sanctions and make sanctions more effective, and deploy forces inside Ukraine, some international forces for peacekeepers. These can be against Putin. Then we could talk to finish this war. Putin cannot fight 10 years. After 10 years in Afghanistan, the Soviet Union collapsed. And now Putin is now recruiting white boys near Moscow. Now this is near the end of the war for Putin too. But Putin is bigger than Zelensky. He can fight 2-3 more years. He can prolong these ceasefire negotiations. And meantime, he's continuing to push and push and push. And his last goal is very clear. He has a very clear goal: make Ukraine puppet nations like Georgia, or at least like Moldova, hopefully like Turkmenistan. Naked, weak, obedient, and just part of Russia, and erase the identity of Ukrainians. That's the purpose of Putin. So even though we have ceasefire, the elections, these things, they want to intervene. They are very strong, robust statecraft for influencing other nations in the free elections. And they want to do that. So we should be prepared for that. We should negotiate with Putin, but ceasefire must be done. And territory not be backed. Then we have to continue sanctions and the deployment of forces. And that must be the cards given to Zelensky. But the opposite is happening. Russia should be back to G8, and the war should be stopped, the general elections, and the Zelensky should be removed. One good news was the minerals. That's good news. Japan made a big mistake when Japan had the war with the Russians. Thanks to intervention by Theodore Roosevelt, we won this war, right? The Russians gave us the railways in Manchuria. And Americans, Mr. Harriman said, okay, US will intervene here, and let's do this together. And imperial government said, no, this is our price. Americans out. And this is a big mistake. If we had American interests in Manchuria, the course of history must be very, very different. What Trump is saying that Americans cannot send troops in Ukraine because that would make Putin very angry. But Trump is saying, no, we are sending our businessmen. But implanting American heavy economic interest in Ukraine is one sort of guarantee to start with.
So you see the ingredients of a successful diplomatic holding pattern in American interest-based commitment to Ukraine because of minerals, European troops on the ground, and keep the pressure on Putin that would allow a pivot of American power to deal with China and Asia, which would be good for Japan. But the way this is happening right now is not reassuring. It actually undermines the whole point.
Let's hope. This is very uncertain what would happen next. The personal relationship Trump-Zelensky are a bit broken, but they have to rehabilitate that. They are leaders. They have to rehabilitate. We have to finish the war. Because Zelensky is now on the verge of the collapse of their military forces. We don't send in our troops. We simply give them intelligence and money and weapons, right? Putin knows it. It's time to finish the war. That's fine. But the maybe end state of the negotiations ought to be ceasefire realized. And Russia refused to return any land, and sanction continues. And US forces and the European forces deployed with the backing up of the Americans. And Americans are everywhere for minerals. This should be an end state.
I imagine Japan will have a role to play in building that consensus again, if it can be done in the Euro-Atlantic, because in the G7, the trust between the US president and European leaders and Canadian leaders right now is low. Japan's going to have to play as Abe did in the G7 under the first Trump administration.
Abe-san was a good diplomat.
Yeah, I know. Ueshiba-san doesn't have the same diplomatic skills, but the people around him do, and Japan may have a big role to play. Let's talk about yes, a critical role. Let's talk about Taiwan at the end here. You and I have done 2 scenario games now in Sydney, US
thank you
and
very
Australia.
much. Very useful for us.
Participation. Really interesting. Learned a lot about each other's strategies and how the 3 countries would think about a contingency. But for people listening, tell us a bit about what you think Japan's role would be in a Taiwan contingency. Would Japan fight? Would there be a military role? What would Japan's position be?
If Taiwan contingency happens, the impact is huge. It's just like Ukraine. Deterring the war is much cheaper. We have to do that. System-wise, 1960, Kishi agreed with Eisenhower, and Eisenhower told us, okay, let's concentrate upon Hokkaido, because Russians will come down there. But there are the ex-Japanese territory and ex-US territory, that's Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines. And the Koreans were fighting against each other, North and South, right? The American position was, okay, let us take care of that. Japan should look at the North, concentrate on Russians. The other surrounding buffer states would be taken care of by the Americans. Let the US use Japanese bases for that purpose. This is the agreement in 1960. 1972, we normalized relationship with China, but this system stays here. And the Taiwan Relations Act was made in the United States by Congress, right? And this system is the same. If Americans go to war for Taiwan defense, they use our bases. They have right to do that. Okay, this is the ground zero. Okay, the first floor is 1999. This was not about Taiwan, about Korea, but Prime Minister Hashimoto and Obuchi told Clinton that we are going to help Americans outside Japan for Korea, but only for non-combat operations. But Koizumi used this law for Afghanistan. And truly, we had a very important role to replenish oil from Bahrain to the middle of Indian Ocean. Americans saved weeks and weeks, just spare time for attacking Taliban in Afghanistan, launching Tomahawks and bombers and Hornets, right? And we used this law. And the last part was, shall we go to war directly using forces? 240,000 very modern forces. It's not small. It's not a big, but it's not small. It's just like UK or French size. And Abe said, just say that. Otherwise, we can't deter Chinese aggression over Taiwan. So we said it. We changed the constitution. We said it. So this is where we are. Now, we have to talk about capabilities. We have to talk about command lines. We have to talk about plans. This is, legal matters. Now the generals, admirals, and the high-ranking officials, diplomats, intelligence people must do their homeworks. One more thing, economic part. This is disaster. In Japan here too, we have 6-7 trillion yen stock markets. 70%, 60% of data is coming from the United States. Same in Taipei, Shanghai, and the Seoul. This American money and European money will withdraw from Asia. All the currencies plummets, right? And the South China Sea, East China Sea, near Taiwan, they are fighting zones, and the lawyers in London will refuse to give them the ship insurance. So they have to make a big detour in the Eastern Pacific from Okhotsk to Japan to Korea, right? That pushes up the materials, iron core, or the bauxite, and the food, and the energy, and the gas. And Asian economy will collapse after this contingency. Of course, the China's trade is stopped, investment is lost, and no trade between China and Japan and maybe with the West. They can be kicked out from the dollar system. And this is disaster for Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and China were the biggest economies in Asia and biggest economies in the world too. We cannot fight. We have to make Xi Jinping understand that. It is not easy to conquer 23 million free people and sending over the Taiwan Straits 100 kilometers and 500,000 soldiers intact. They can never do that. We have missiles, we have subs. So this is stupid war. Two things are very different. Chinese are very strong. They might do it. And two, Taiwan is a free nation now. They're behaving themselves. They never say we're independent. because they are on de facto basis independent. We're happy with that, they say. Taiwanese are truly behaving themselves, but they're, after democratization, 10%, only 13% are Kuomintang dictators. 87% were indigenous Taiwanese. They were Japanese 50 years. And they were oppressed by Chiang Kai-shek, and they regained the very high status of Chan Chin-go and Vietnam Free. And they are very proud of themselves. 100 years different history from China. And they are not free people. And Beijing can never accept it. They have Uyghurs, they have Tibetans, they have Inner Mongolians. They can never accept the special status to Taiwan. But Taiwan is Taiwan. From the beginning, there were two Chinas. Kissinger said there are only one China simply because Mao and Chiang both say there's one China. So we don't disagree. But on de facto basis, we have two Chinas here. And we said, okay, we go along with the theory of one China, Chiang Kai-shek and Mao, that's fine. But there are on de facto basis two China. Only one condition for normalization, don't fight against each other. The Taiwan Strait must be at peace. Then we go along with the Chinese theory. One China is fine. Beijing is represented, that's fine. But please don't fight. And we have to vindicate our commitment here.
Nobu, I feel like we could do an entire podcast series just on Japanese strategy right now, because there really is a clarity. There's debate, of course, but there's a clarity in thinking about geopolitics in Tokyo that just does not exist in Washington or in Seoul or even in Canberra or London or even Singapore, I'd argue. There's an experience dealing with the shock of the economy slowing down, the rise of China, questions about the U.S. that has just driven strategic thinking. Abe-sama is a catalyst and the leader, but really, as you know, this is decades, centuries of debate and thought converging at a really interesting time in Japanese history. But we do have to end. So many, many thanks. This has been a good window.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed a lot.
Yeah, good window into the strategic thinking in Tokyo. I think people will learn a lot.
See you in Sydney. Get this autumn.
Yes, see you in Sydney or Tokyo.
For more on strategy and the Asia program's work, visit the CSIS website at csis.org and click on the Asia program page. And for more on the U.S. Studies Center in Sydney, please visit ussc.edu.au.